guys, it's Julie Spencer, author of the Buxton Peak series. We are working our way through Buxton Peak, the early years. This is the prequel to my Buxton Peak trilogy. And hoping that you're liking the videos so far. If you are, please give me a thumbs up and like and subscribe to my channel and share these videos with others so that we can get the word out to other people. Okay, we are starting into chapter 10 of Buxton Peak, the early years, and that is called Kirtland. So, Buxton Peak, the early years, chapter 10, Kirtland. Could I have just a few minutes by myself in the temple? Why? Gary creased his eyebrows. If Ian needs time to himself, we should give him that respect, Kai said. It's his church, not ours. Well, technically, this temple isn't owned by our church anymore, Ian explained. The Kirtland Temple is not dedicated. It's just a beautiful historical building. Ian's voice trailed off. The white stucco shone in the late afternoon sun. He'd felt drawn to the temple for the past 100 miles. Once he realized they would pass right by Kirtland, Ohio, on their way to their show in Cleveland, he couldn't get it off his mind. He insisted, in no uncertain terms, that they take a detour. He knew they wouldn't be late for their show, because it wasn't until the following day. They had plenty of time, and time was what he needed right now. Ian suspected there was more to this inner turmoil than what he was willing to admit, even to himself, much less out loud. The guys would freak out if they knew, he thought. It's absurd. It's never going to happen. Ian dismissed his band members and stepped forward as if in a trance. He knew he was supposed to wait for the guide who was scheduled to take them on a private tour, but their bus had arrived 10 minutes early. It was just as well. He needed to do this on his own. He half expected the door to be locked, but it creaked open, heavy and majestic. He tried to close the door quietly behind him, but cringed as the sound echoed in the cavernous space of the temple's interior. Ian climbed the stairs and stepped gingerly up the aisle until he shuffled into one of the narrow wooden pews. It just felt like the right place to sit. He bowed his head. The words wouldn't come. He was afraid to even think them. He knew he couldn't vocalize his question because he was terrified of the answer. He already knew the answer. No, 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 no. This is not happening. This is not happening. I can't do it, Lord. I can't do it. I can't. Ian's head fell forward into his hands and tears streamed down his face. His heart ached for what his head wanted. His head pounded from the truth that had been there all along. Since the time he was in primary class at church, the songs he'd sung over and over as a little boy came rushing into his mind. Jesus wants me for a sunbeam. I love to see the temple. I am a child of God. I hope they call me on a mission. When I've grown up, just like the song says, I'm ready to teach and preach and work like a missionary. This can't be happening. Please, God, don't do this to me. Don't make me choose. Ian knew his own thoughts before they surfaced. I've already chosen. I chose this path 1,000,000 years ago. I've been on this path my entire mortal life. Tears showed as a peace came into his heart. Another song Ian knew very well came flooding into his mind, a hymn that had been sung at this very spot on March 27, 1836, for the dedication of the Kirtland Temple. The Spirit of God like a fire is burning. This time he didn't just think the words to his favorite hymn, he sang it out loud, hesitant at first, and then with more and more power until it filled the room. The second verse captured his attention as he sang, The Lord is extending the saints' understanding, restoring their... Ian's voice trailed off as his breath caught. You're extending this offer to me, Lord. You're not making me choose. You're offering me a gift. I'm torn, Father. My band needs me. I'm their front man. I'm their singer, their songwriter, their leader. I can't just abandon them. You'll never regret it, a voice from behind him spoke softly. Ian jumped in his seat as a weathered old man settled into the pew beside him. I'll never regret what? What? The man's brows crinkled and his head cocked to the side. That's what I ask you, Ian said. I'm so confused. What are you doing in here? I thought you wanted a tour of the temple. I do want a tour of the temple. The man turned in his seat and looked directly into Ian's eyes. His gaze pierced through to Ian's heart, and he felt a shiver run over him from the top of his head to the tips of his toes and fingers. "Are you ready to go?" "Go where?" Ian whispered. "Wherever you're called," he heard. "On a tour of the temple." The man stood from the pew and gestured that Ian should come with him. Ian's gaze followed off the end of the man's outstretched arm to the front of the building, where the late afternoon sun shone through the window at the front of the temple. Tiny dust motes danced in a pillar of light. A pillar of light? The story of the prophet Joseph Smith's first vision of God and Jesus, while praying in a grove of trees in upstate New York, came rushing over Ian's mind. Joseph had seen a pillar of light also, while praying in a grove of trees in upstate New York. Ian's voice was barely a whisper. "I think I've seen all I came to witness." "Well, then my work here's done." "My work has barely begun." Ian's gaze returned to the face of his guide, and the two men regarded one another for a moment. "Thank you for coming today." A simple dismissal. "Thank you for having me." Ian felt the awe of the moment. He felt warmth prick the corners of his eyes. "God, give me courage. I'm going to need it." "Ian, you look like you've seen a ghost." Kai placed his hand on Ian's shoulder, and Ian met his best mate's gaze. "No, I'm pretty sure it was real." Ian glanced back at the temple and felt more confident than ever that he was making the right choice. He wasn't sure how he was going to break the news. For now, he had more immediate things to discuss. "We need to change up our set." "What do you mean?" Kai raised his eyebrows. "Change our set." "I mean, we need to remove anything suggestive or lewd." Ian started walking quickly in the direction of the tour bus. He bounded up the stairs 2 at a time and came around to face Andy and Gary. They had controllers in their hands and were deep into a competitive video game. "Guys, put down the controllers. We don't have much time." "Time for what?" Gary didn't look up from the game. "Sex and drugs," Ian said. "We have to get them out of our songs." "We can't have sex," Ian stated. "There aren't any girls in this town younger than 60. Gary and Andy gave each other a fist bump without taking their eyes off the game. "How do you propose we take all the sex and drugs out of our songs?" Kai ascended the stairs, out of breath from hurrying after Ian. "Sex, drugs, and rock and roll," Andy mused. "All we'll have left is rock and roll." "I like rock and roll." Ian pulled out a drawer and found a pad of paper and a pencil. "We're going to change our lyrics." That grabbed everyone's attention. "We have a show in," Kai looked at his watch, "less than 24 hours. You can't just change our songs." "I can, and I will." Ian held eye contact with Kai, challenging him to relent. Something clicked into place behind Kai's fiery expression. Ian raised his eyebrows, and Kai finally looked away. "Fine, you're the singer." Kai pulled a beer out of the mini fridge. He twisted the cap and flopped onto the sofa. "I'm just here to play guitar." "Well, you're going to have to learn the new lyrics because you're my backup." Ian kept his head down and furiously scribbled on the paper, finding words that not only rhymed but also made sense. "Whatever." Kai took a long pull from his beer and stared out the window of the motorhome. "I want each of you to pick out a couple of songs from back when we were younger and our music was cleaner, because there are several tunes we're going to have to eliminate altogether." "Eliminate?" Andy sat forward. "This has been our set for the entire tour. The fans expect it. These are the songs from our latest CD. You can't just eliminate them." Ian didn't bother speaking this time. He looked up from his writing and stared into Andy's eyes until Andy backed down. It didn't take him as long as Kai. Gary didn't even bother arguing. He stood and started for the door. "Where are you going, pal?" Andy asked. "I'm going out to have a smoke. I can't handle this tension in here. It's stressing me out." "I'm coming with you." Andy tossed the game controller aside and hopped up from his chair. "Don't you dare smoke near the temple," Ian called after them. "I wouldn't dream of it," Gary said. "We'll take a nice long walk into those woods where no one will smell our evil drugs." "What's going on, gentlemen?" Jeremy stepped into the motorhome just before Andy and Gary could leave. "Ian's insane." Gary raised his chin in Ian's direction. "He's gone off the deep end." Andy nodded in agreement. Jeremy chuckled at their banter and strolled past them to nudge Kai over and sit down. What is this phantom presence that has stolen the sanity from our fearless leader? Phantom is a good way to describe it, Kai said. Ian saw a ghost in the temple. I'm telling you, he was real. Ian never looked up from his scribbling. He crossed off one word and wrote another, drawing lines and diagrams across the paper. Gary and Andy still had not left the motorhome. They leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, with patient expressions. When Ian looked around the room, it was as if they were all waiting for him to explain himself. He decided now was as good a time as any. Oh, and I've decided to serve a mission. Andy's jaw dropped. Jeremy sat forward and put his head in his hands, and Kai gripped his beer bottle so hard Ian was afraid it would break. His nostrils flared and his eyes sparked. His breathing sped up and he started shaking. What, like to Mars? Gary seemed to be clueless. He's talking about his stupid church, Kai said. Vitriol hung in his words. They dress up in monkey suits and go around preaching to people. You want to be a preacher, Ian? Gary's brow creased and his jaw went slack. I don't understand. One, it's not stupid. Ian set down his pencil and shoved the table aside, leaning closer to his mates. And two, it's not forever. Trust me, 2 years is gonna feel like forever. Kai pressed his lips into a thin line. 2 years? Gary sounded as if he was going to cry. We have shows to do. He can't leave until after the tour, Jeremy explained. He'd be in breach of contract. He knows that. Jeremy sat back and pressed himself against the sofa, craning his neck to see out the window in the direction of the temple. I'm not going to abandon you guys. Ian looked at each one in turn, Kai last. They held each other's stare for a long moment, communicating in their own nonverbal way. They would always be best mates, and they would always understand one another more than anyone else could grasp. Ian didn't even cringe as he held Kai's glare. I won't. I promise. Kai stood up suddenly, towering over Ian. With narrowed eyes, Kai shook his head, reached into the fridge for another beer, and stomped to the back room of the motorhome, slamming the door behind him. Gee, that went over well. Ian grabbed his pencil and bent over his paper again, ignoring the stares of the other three. Barely registering his change in cadence, Ian looked up at Jeremy. You can tell the driver that we're ready to leave for Cleveland. We have a show to do in less than 24 hours. Jeremy raised his eyebrows at Ian, opened his mouth to respond, then looked away and stood to go find the driver. Ian went back to his editing project with Andy and Gary glaring at him. Eventually, they turned the video game back on, but the tone of their interaction had changed. They were sullen and apathetic. Kai could be heard in the back room strumming an acoustic guitar. As the driver pulled the motorhome out of Kirtland, Ian glanced back out the window at the temple shining in the twilight, and he knew he'd made the right decision. Ian stood before the microphone and dropped both arms to his sides. This was the moment between the second-to-last song and the final number for the night. This was the time when he usually took just a moment to address their fans and say goodnight. Today, he knew he was saying goodbye, but he also needed to disguise his absence. Ian had never denied he was a member of the church, but he hadn't broadcast it to the world either. If he could slip quietly away and disguise himself well enough, he was sure he could devote 2 years of his life in the service of the Lord. He'd rehearsed in his mind for weeks the words he wanted to say. He took a deep breath. It's been amazing to be here with you in America, Ian said. The crowd knew this was the final show of the band's North American tour, and they quieted as best they could in a stadium filled with 50,000 screaming girls. But it's time for us to say goodbye for now. Boos filled the stadium, and Ian felt tears prick the sides of his eyes. He put his hand over his heart, feeling the pressure there. He felt as if he was choking. He pulled himself together and continued. We're heading back to the UK, and we'll be there long enough to rest and write some more songs and get a new CD recorded. That brought cheers from the audience. Ian didn't mention that he'd already written all the songs for the next CD, or that the band had almost completely recorded those songs. I promise we'll announce tour dates as soon as we're able, and we'll be back in America soon. Kai took that as his cue to start the riff for their final tune. Ian sang with his whole heart and soul, leaving it all on that stage one last time before he hung up the microphone for 2 years and dedicated himself to the Lord's work. As the final notes reached the rafters, tears pooled in his eyes. Before he lost it completely, he called into the microphone, "Goodbye, America!" The crowd erupted as the 4 guys of Buxton Peak came together in the middle of the stage in their now traditional group hug. Ian's shoulders shook as they spoke in unison one last time. "Let's rock!" Kai and Andy held each one of Ian's arms around their shoulders as he stumbled into the protection of the curtains. When he was far enough into the shadows, Ian crumpled to his knees and sobbed into his hands, tears unrestrained, not caring who was close enough to see. He spoke into his hands and knew only one being heard him. "Lord, remind me that I'm making the right choice." The power of God's Spirit poured over him. There was no doubt in his heart, but saying goodbye was nearly impossible. So that is the end of chapter 10, and next time we will turn into chapter 11, which is called Rock of Ages. And if you have been liking Buxton Peak the early years and all the videos, I hope that you will give me a thumbs up and like the video and subscribe to my channel, and we'll see you in the next video.